The following morning, as Sarah stood outside the glass tower in the financial district, rain hammering against her borrowed umbrella, she couldn't stop thinking about the last time she'd seen her mother. 8 years ago, the night everything ended, the night's men had come, and the night she'd learned what it meant to survive when everyone else didn't. Welcome back, my beautiful souls and kindred spirits. Before we start, go ahead and subscribe and share where you're watching from. It always warms my heart to see our little storytelling family stretch across the world. Every click, every comment, every bit of love you give helps us keep uncovering these unforgettable stories together. So find your quiet place, settle in, and let me take you somewhere you've never been before. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse. No hallway, no warning, just marble floors that gleamed like black ice and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city 50 stories below. Sarah stepped out, her borrowed heels clicking too loud in the silence, and felt the space swallow her whole. Luxury didn't begin to describe it. This was power made tangible. Clean lines and cold surfaces. Leather furniture positioned with mathematical precision. Art on the walls that she recognized from her research, stolen pieces, most of them liberated from collections that no longer existed because their owners had made the mistake of crossing Jin-suk. The air smelled expensive, rich leather, and something cleaner, sharper, like the air in a hospital, sterile and controlled. Beneath it, barely perceptible, was the metallic tang of gun oil. She'd smelled it enough times to recognize it instantly, to know that somewhere within arm's reach of wherever Jin-suk sat, death waited in a holster. "Miss Miles." His voice came from the shadows near the windows. "You're early." She turned. He sat behind a desk carved from a single piece of dark wood, his wheelchair positioned perfectly to catch the morning light. It made him look softer somehow, more human, until you met his eyes and realized softness was a lie he wore like armor. "I don't like to waste time," Sarah said, keeping her voice level. "Neither do I." He gestured to a chair across from him. The leather was cold through her slacks, and she resisted the urge to shift, to show discomfort. The desk between them felt both like protection and like a trap, keeping her at a distance while ensuring she couldn't run. "Before we begin, there's someone you should meet." Jin-suk pressed a button on his desk. "Hyun-woo, please come in." The door behind her opened so silently, she only knew because the air changed. Footsteps approached, measured and confident. And then a man appeared in her peripheral vision. Hyun-woo was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, polished, perfect, and utterly cold, tall and lean in a suit that fit like a second skin. His face angular and sharp. His smile warm in a way that made her skin crawl because it didn't reach his eyes. "Deal," she said. Jin-suk nodded once. "Then let's begin." 3 days bled into one another like wounds that wouldn't close. Sarah learned the patterns of the penthouse. When the guards changed shift, which cameras had blind spots. How Hyun-woo moved through the space like he owned it, because in every way except officially, he did. She documented everything. Photograph files with a camera hidden in her watch. Recorded conversations with equipment so sophisticated it picked up whispers through reinforced glass. Followed money trails that twisted through shell companies and offshore accounts until her eyes burned and her hands shook from too much coffee and not enough sleep. And through it all, Jin-suk watched, not obviously. He was too controlled for that. But she felt his attention like a physical weight, felt him measuring her against some internal standard she couldn't see. He rarely spoke to her directly during office hours, maintaining the professional distance between boss and assistant. But after 6 p.m., when the building emptied, he'd call her into his office and they'd sit in the dim light reviewing her findings like scholars studying ancient texts. It was during those hours that Sarah began to understand him. Not like him. She could never like a man who'd ordered her sister's death, but understand. He thought in layers, in contingencies upon contingencies. Every word he spoke was calculated. Every gesture meant something. He was a man who'd learned that vulnerability was death, so he'd armored himself in control so absolute it had become a cage. She understood that kind of prison. She'd built one herself. On the 4th night, Jin-suk leaned back in his chair and studied the documents she'd spread across his desk. Financial records showing Hyun-woo's accounts receiving payments from a company that didn't exist. Communication logs proving he'd met with Choi family representatives 3 times in the past month. Security footage she'd spliced together, showing him accessing files he had no authorization to view. "It's good work," Jin-suk said finally. "But it's not enough." Sarah's frustration flared hot. "It proves he's been in contact with your enemies. It proves he's stealing information. What more do you need?" Context. He tapped one of the documents. "These payments could be explained as legitimate business expenses if he has the right documentation. The meetings could be dismissed as intelligence gathering. The file access could be attributed to his position. I need something that can't be rationalized away." "Like what?" "Like proof he's planning to move against me." Jin-suk's voice was flat. "Evidence of an assassination attempt. A recorded conversation where he explicitly commits treason. Something that would force the council's hand. That could take weeks. Then we work for weeks." He met her eyes. "Unless you're tired of looking for your answers." The challenge was clear. "This is it," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. "Everything you asked for." Jin-suk wheeled closer, his dark eyes scanning the documents with the focused intensity of a predator tracking prey. Financial records showing payments from the Choi family to shell corporations Hyun-woo controlled. Encrypted communications she'd decrypted using tools she'd learned from people whose names she'd never speak aloud. Security footage showing Hyun-woo meeting with known Choi enforcers in locations far from any legitimate business. And the final piece, the one that had taken days to acquire and nearly gotten her killed, a recorded conversation between Hyun-woo and a Choi family lieutenant discussing the logistics of eliminating Jin-suk during the family council meeting. "The building has structural weaknesses on the third floor," Hyun-woo's voice said from the small recorder. "A gas line that runs through the council chamber. If the ignition is timed correctly, it will look like an accident. Old building, poor maintenance, tragic loss of leadership, and you're certain Jin-suk will be in the chamber." The Choi lieutenant asked. "He never misses council meetings. His pride won't allow it." Hyun-woo's voice was smooth, calm, as casual as if he were discussing dinner plans. "Once he's dead, I'll assume emergency leadership. 3 months to consolidate power. 6 months to transfer key assets to your family. A year to complete the merger. The council won't accept you automatically. They will if I'm the only option standing. I've already arranged for the other candidates to be indisposed during the incident." The recording ended. Silence filled the penthouse like water filling a drowning man's lungs. Jin-suk sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the armrests of his wheelchair, his expression carved from stone. Sarah watched him, saw the minute tension in his jaw, the way his breathing had gone shallow and controlled. He asked finally, "The council meeting is in 5 days. And this recording, how did you get it?" "Hyun-woo's car. He has it swept for bugs daily, but I placed a device in the air conditioning system that only activates when it detects his voice pattern." She paused. "He won't know it's there until it's too late." "Did he see you? Are you certain?" She met his eyes. "I'm good at this, Jin-suk. You hired me because I'm good at this." It was the first time she'd used his name without the formal Mr. The intimacy of it hung between them, unexpected and heavy. His expression shifted. Something flickering in his dark eyes that might have been approval or might have been something more dangerous. "You're better than good," he said quietly. "You're exceptional." The compliment shouldn't have warmed her. She was here for justice, for her sister, for the truth about that night 8 years ago. Not for the approval of a man who'd built an empire on violence and fear. But it warmed her anyway. "What do we do now?" she asked, pushing past the dangerous flutter in her chest. The council meeting was set for 2 p.m. in the old building on the east side, a relic from the syndicate's founding days, all dark wood and darker history. Sarah arrived at noon, 2 hours early, dressed in the crisp black suit Jin-suk had provided and carrying enough concealed weapons to start a small war. She wasn't supposed to be here. Assistants didn't attend council meetings, but Jin-suk had been explicit. She was to position herself in the observation gallery above the chamber, hidden from view, but close enough to act if everything went wrong. The building smelled like old smoke and older secrets. Sarah made her way through the corridors, nodding to the guards who'd been briefed to expect her, and climbed the narrow stairs to the gallery. The space was barely more than a balcony, enclosed by ornate wooden screens that allowed her to see into the chamber below while remaining invisible. She settled into position, checked her weapons, and waited. At 1:45, the council members began to arrive. 11 men and 2 women, all of them old enough to have survived decades in a business where most died young. They took their seats around the massive circular table, their faces carved from stone, their eyes calculating. At 1:55, Hyun-woo entered. He looked perfect. Expensive suit, warm smile, every inch the loyal second in command. He greeted each council member with practiced deference, made small talk about family and business, and gave no indication that beneath the chamber, a bomb was waiting to reduce them all to ash. At 2 exactly, Jin-suk arrived. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to the door as he wheeled himself in, his face impassive, his movements controlled. He looked exactly as he always did, contained, untouchable, a king in all but name. Sarah's heart hammered. She knew what was hidden beneath that carefully maintained facade, knew the pain each movement caused him, knew that tonight after this was over, they'd return to the penthouse and he'd collapse into her arms, exhausted and triumphant. If he survived, gentlemen, ladies. Jin-suk's voice carried through the chamber. Thank you for coming. We have much to discuss. The meeting began: business matters, territory disputes, profit margins, alliance negotiations, standard syndicate politics. Sarah watched Hyun-woo carefully, saw the way his eyes kept flicking to his watch, saw the tension in his shoulders despite his calm expression. He was waiting. The bomb was set to detonate at 2:30. 30 minutes to get through the preliminary business and excuse himself on some pretext, leaving the council to die while he established his alibi. At 2:15, Sarah's earpiece crackled. Marcus's voice barely a whisper. Bomb located. 3rd floor gas line exactly where the recording said, disarming now. She touched her own mic twice in acknowledgement. Felt her breathing ease slightly. One threat neutralized, but Hyun-woo wouldn't rely on a single method. Men like him always had contingencies. At 2:20, Hyun-woo stood. My apologies, but I need to take an urgent call. 5 minutes he left the chamber. Sarah tracked his movement through the screens, watched him walk down the corridor, pull out his phone, make a call. His expression was calm, but she'd learned to read the micro-expressions beneath the mask. He was confused. The bomb should have gone off by now. At 2:25, he returned, took his seat, and Sarah saw it. The slight bulge beneath his jacket, not a phone, a weapon. He was going to do it himself. Her hand went to her own gun. Every muscle tensed. In the chamber below, Jin-suk was speaking. Which brings us to matters of internal security. There have been concerns raised about loyalty, about members of this organization working with our enemies. Hyun-woo's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw his hand drift toward his jacket. I have evidence, Jin-suk continued, his voice even, of systematic betrayal, financial records, communications, recorded conversations. Sir, Hyun-woo's voice was smooth. Perhaps we should discuss this in private. Jin-suk's tone was absolute. The council needs to hear this, needs to understand the depth of the rot. He gestured. Marcus entered carrying a tablet. Set it on the table. Pressed play. Hyun-woo's voice filled the chamber, discussing the bombing, the murder of the council, the transfer of power, every word a nail in his coffin. For 3 seconds, no one moved. Then chaos. Hyun-woo surged to his feet, gun appearing in his hand with practiced speed, but he didn't aim at Jin-suk. He aimed at the tablet, at the evidence, trying to destroy it before. Sarah moved. She'd calculated the angle earlier, mapped the trajectory. One shot through the decorative screen, carefully placed to disarm without killing. She needed him alive, needed him to confess. The council chamber was silent, except for the sound of Hyun-woo breathing. 3 days had passed since his capture. 3 days of interrogation, revelation, and the systematic dismantling of everything he'd built, his network of informants exposed, his offshore accounts seized, his allies within the organization identified and removed with surgical efficiency. Now he knelt in the center of the council chamber, wrists bound, blood crusted at his temple where Jin-suk's strike had landed. 13 council members sat in judgment, their faces carved from stone, their eyes cold with betrayal. Sarah stood in the observation gallery above, watching. She'd earned her place there through blood and cunning and the choice to save rather than kill. Jin-suk had insisted she witness this, the culmination of everything they'd fought for. The evidence is conclusive. Jin-suk's voice carried through the chamber, not from a wheelchair, but from his feet. He'd walked into the meeting upright, shocking every council member who believed his paralysis absolute. Hyun-woo Park conspired with the Choi family to eliminate leadership and transfer organizational control. His communications are recorded. His financial crimes are documented. His assassination plot is proven. One of the elder council members, a woman who'd survived 3 syndicate wars, leaned forward. These are capital crimes. The punishment is death. Does anyone dispute this? Silence. Not even Hyun-woo spoke in his own defense. Then it settled. The elder's voice was flat. Hyun-woo Park, you are sentenced to. Jin-suk's hand lifted. Before sentence is passed, there's something the council should know about the safe house attack 8 years ago. This wasn't part of the plan. The attack that killed 17 civilians, Jin-suk continued, his voice steady, including children. The attack that was supposed to be a precision strike on Choi family weapons cache. The intelligence that mission was based on came from Hyun-woo. He falsified reports, confirmed targets that didn't exist, recommended incendiary charges on a residential building. Another council member demanded, to destabilize my leadership, to make me look reckless, brutal, to sow doubt among our allies and fear among our people. Jin-suk's eyes found Hyun-woo. Those deaths were supposed to be my burden to carry, my sin to answer for. But they were yours. Every child, every innocent, yours, prove it. Hyun-woo's voice was raw but defiant. You can't prove I falsified anything. Sarah spoke from the gallery, her voice carrying clear and strong. Every head turned to look at her. Because I have the original intelligence reports. The ones you submitted before falsifying them. The ones that clearly identified the target as a residential building with civilian occupants. She descended the stairs, holding a file folder she'd retrieved from the deepest archives of Jin-suk's intelligence network. Marcus had helped her find it, buried under layers of misdirection and false documentation. But it was there. This is Sarah Miles, Jin-suk said as she entered the chamber proper. Survivor of that attack. Daughter of one of the families we were supposed to protect. She came here hunting revenge. She stayed because she learned the truth. Sarah set the folder on the council table. Let them see the evidence. Original reports versus falsified versions. The difference is stark and damning. He knew there were children inside, she said quietly, confirmed it in his preliminary report, then changed it in his final recommendation, made them disappear on paper so they could be murdered in reality. The chamber erupted, not with noise. The council didn't do anything as undignified as shouting, but with cold, contained fury, the kind of rage that ended with bodies and rivers and names erased from history. Is this true? The elder demanded, her voice cutting through the tension. Hyun-woo met her eyes and smiled. Every word. I falsified the intelligence, orchestrated the massacre, used those deaths to weaken Jin-suk's position with our international allies. It was brilliant strategy. It almost worked. Almost. Jin-suk's voice was deadly quiet. You survived both politically and literally. Hyun-woo's eyes found Sarah. And apparently, you couldn't help yourself. Had to play hero. Had to save one of the children from the rubble. Compromised your own operation because you're weak. I'm not weak. Jin-suk took 3 steps toward Hyun-woo. Each movement controlled despite the pain Sarah knew it caused. I'm human. Something you stopped being years ago. Humanity is a liability in our world. Jin-suk stopped directly in front of Hyun-woo, looking down at the kneeling traitor. Humanity is what separates us from animals, what makes loyalty possible, what gives our actions meaning beyond mere survival. He turned to the council. Hyun-woo is guilty of every crime we've accused him of. But more than that, he's guilty of destroying the fundamental trust that holds this organization together. He made us monsters in the eyes of the world. Made me a monster in the eyes of innocents who deserved our protection. So kill me. Hyun-woo's voice was flat. Pull the trigger. Restore your honor through my blood. Jin-suk's hand moved to his hip, drawing the compact pistol he'd carried since the night in the hospital when he'd first learned to shoot from a wheelchair. But he didn't aim it at Hyun-woo. 8 years. 8 years of believing her mother was either dead or irretrievably lost. 8 years of hunting ghosts through shadows. The door opened. Her mother stood in the threshold, older, thinner, marked by survival in ways that made Sarah's own scars seem insignificant. Natural coils gone silver at the temples. Brown skin weathered by years of hiding. Eyes that still held light despite everything. Baby girl, her mother whispered. Sarah broke. All the control, all the careful walls she'd built, shattered like glass. She was across the threshold and in her mother's arms before conscious thought registered, sobbing into her shoulder like the 18-year-old who'd been pulled from burning rubble. I looked for you. Sarah gasped between sobs. I looked everywhere. 8 years, Mama. 8 years, I thought. I'm sorry. Her mother's hands stroked her hair, familiar and achingly missed. I'm so sorry. They stood like that for long minutes, crying together, mourning the years stolen from them. When Sarah finally pulled back enough to breathe, she saw Jin Suk still in the doorway, giving them space but present, watching with an expression she couldn't quite read. Her mother followed her gaze, stiffened slightly. Then, to Sarah's shock, bowed her head in a gesture of profound respect. Jin Suk, her mother said quietly. Thank you for keeping your promise. Mrs. Jin Suk wheeled forward into the modest living room. I only regret it took 8 years to fulfill it. Sarah looked between them, understanding dawning cold and clear. You knew, both of you. This whole time you knew each other. Sit down, baby. Her mother guided her to a warm couch. There are things I need to tell you. Things I should have told you years ago. Sarah sat. Jin Suk positioned his wheelchair nearby, close enough to reach if she needed him, far enough to give mother and daughter space. The gesture spoke of care that made her chest ache. The night of the fire, her mother began, her voice steady despite the pain threading through it. We weren't just civilians caught in crossfire. Your father, my husband, he worked for the Choi family intelligence division. I didn't know until after we married. After you and Adriana were born, by then I was trapped. The world tilted. Daddy worked for. He didn't have a choice. They owned his family's debt. Threatened to kill his parents if he didn't cooperate. Her mother's hands twisted in her lap. I wanted to leave. Take you girls and disappear. But they were watching. Always watching. The safe house, Jin Suk said quietly, was a Choi family asset, intelligence station disguised as residential housing. Your father worked there coordinating attacks against my organization, but the children, Sarah whispered. Adriana, the others shouldn't have been there. Her mother's voice cracked. Your father promised me they'd evacuate families before operations. Promised the building would be clear. He lied. Or his superiors lied to him. Either way, when Mr. Jin Suk's men attacked, they attacked what they believed was a legitimate military target. Hyun-woo gave me intelligence confirming it was purely operational. Jin Suk added, no civilians, no families. Standard protocol required evacuation warnings, but Hyun-woo bypassed that too. Made it look like the Choi family had already cleared the building. 8 years of rage, of grief, of burning need for revenge. All of it built on incomplete truths. Adriana died because Daddy's employers used her as a shield. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. And your father died trying to save her. The Choi family executed him 3 days later for failing to protect their intelligence assets. They blamed him for the attack. Said he'd compromised security. And you? Sarah's voice was hollow. How did you survive? Jin Suk pulled me from the rubble after he pulled you. Got both of us to the clinic. Then he came to me with an offer. Her mother looked at Jin Suk. Protection in exchange for information. Everything I knew about Choi family operations, their structure, their plans. You became his informant. I became his ally. Her mother's voice was firm. He didn't threaten me, didn't force me. He offered me safety and the chance to hurt the people who'd gotten my daughter killed. I took it. Jin Suk's expression remained neutral. Your mother's intelligence helped dismantle 3 Choi family operations, saved countless lives, including mine. She warned me about an assassination attempt that would have succeeded without her. So you hit her. Sarah looked at her mother, seeing her with new eyes. Not a victim, a survivor, a player in the same deadly game Sarah had been playing for 3 months. For 8 years, you've been working with him. For 8 years, I've been trying to stay alive long enough to see you again. Her mother reached for Sarah's hand. Mr. Jin Suk promised me that if you ever came looking, he'd keep you safe, protect you the way I couldn't. Is that why you let me infiltrate? Sarah turned to Jin Suk. Because you promised her partially. His honesty was brutal as always, but also because I recognized your skills. Saw how you moved, how you thought. You inherited your mother's intelligence and your father's tactical mind. Wasting that seemed criminal, so you used me. Both of you, we protected you. Her mother corrected gently. Every step you took, Mr. Jin Suk was watching, guiding, making sure you didn't stumble into traps that would have killed you. Maybe acceptance isn't the same as approval. Her hand moved without permission, hovering near his on the armrest. Not touching. Not yet. Maybe it's just recognition. Monster to monster. Her name was a warning. I should hate you. The words came fast now. Pressure releasing from a damaged valve. Every time I look at you, I should see my sister burning. Should hear her screaming. Should feel the wire cutting into my wrists while your men set the world on fire. But you don't. The admission tasted like betrayal. I see the man who pulled me from the rubble, who paid for my treatment, who's giving me the only thing I've wanted for 8 years. The truth is ugly. Sarah, when you read that file, when you find your mother, you'll discover things that can't be unknown. His hand finally moved, covering hers on the armrest. His palm was warm, scarred along the knuckles, familiar in ways that made her chest ache. You'll learn that war creates only victims. That your mother made choices, too. That nothing is as simple as revenge. I know that her voice was steady despite the electricity racing up her arm from where his skin met hers. I've known it since the night you told me Hyun-woo orchestrated the intelligence. But knowing doesn't make the grief stop. Doesn't make me stop wanting someone to pay. Hyun-woo will pay. Jin-suk's thumb traced the scar on her wrist, that raised line of old violence. In 48 hours, this ends. Either he dies or I do. Either way, your debt is settled. It's not about debt anymore. Sarah turned her hand, letting their palms press together. The gesture was intimate, binding, more dangerous than any weapon she'd ever held. It stopped being about debt the night you showed me you could stand. The night you trusted me with your biggest weakness. That wasn't trust. That was strategy. But his fingers tightened around hers, contradicting the words, liar. She leaned closer, their faces inches apart, close enough to see his pupils dilate, to feel his breath against her lips. You trusted me because you're as lonely as I am. Because you're surrounded by people who want your power. And I'm the only one who just wants you alive. The question was barely audible over the rain. Why do you want me alive? Because she saw herself reflected in him. Because his loneliness echoed hers. Because somewhere between the cafe and this penthouse, between hatred and understanding, she'd stopped hunting him and started protecting him. Because I need you, she whispered, and felt the truth of it settle like stone in her chest. Because if you die, I'm alone again, and I can't survive that twice. Jin-suk's free hand came up, cupping her face with a gentleness that contradicted everything she knew about him. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, wiping away tears she hadn't known were falling. You're stronger than you think, he said. You survived fire and grief and 8 years of planning revenge. You could survive my death. I don't want to. Her voice cracked. I don't want to survive you, Jin-suk. I want to live with you, even if it makes me a traitor. Even if it damns me. The confession hung between them, irreversible. Outside, lightning split the sky, casting the penthouse in stark white light. In that flash, Sarah saw everything. His face etched with exhaustion and desire, his hand trembling against her cheek, his eyes holding something that looked like devotion. If we do this, he said carefully, there's no going back. No pretending this was just a job. No walking away clean. I stopped being clean the moment I sat down in that cafe. Then we're both damned. He leaned forward, closing the space between them until his forehead rested against hers. Not a kiss. Something more intimate. A promise made in silence and skin. 48 hours, Sarah. 48 hours to end this war. And then, we figure out what we are. His breath was warm against her mouth. What we are. They stayed like that, breathing the same air, hands clasped, until the rain finally began to slow. When Sarah finally pulled back, she saw her own reflection in the dark windows. A woman kneeling beside a wheelchair, holding the hand of the man who destroyed her family and saved her life. She looked like salvation. She looked like sin. She looked exactly like what she'd become. 36 hours later, Sarah stood in the doorway of Jin-suk's private quarters, watching him pretend to die. The room was smaller than the main penthouse, more intimate, dark wood and darker shadows. A bed that looked too soft for a man who'd trained himself to survive in wheelchairs. Medical equipment arranged with calculated precision. For stands, monitors, oxygen tanks, all of it real. All of it unnecessary. Jin-suk lay propped against pillows, his face pale, breathing shallow. The performance was flawless. If Sarah hadn't spent the past 2 weeks watching him walk 15 steps every midnight, hadn't felt his strength when he gripped her hands, she'd believe he was dying. "He's coming," Marcus said quietly from his position near the window. The security chief's voice was tight with controlled violence. Hyun-woo just entered the building alone. "Good." Jin-suk's eyes stayed closed, but his voice was steady. "Sarah, position." She moved to the chair beside his bed, the nervous assistant clutching her employer's hand as death approached. Her other hand rested in her lap, two in from the compact pistol hidden in her blazer. Close enough. Always close enough. The door opened without warning. Hyun-woo entered like a man who already owned the room. His suit was pristine, his expression concerned in a way that would fool cameras, and his eyes swept the space with predatory efficiency. He saw Marcus first, expected, permitted. Then Sarah, irrelevant, beneath notice. Finally, Jin-suk, the prize, the target, the obstacle about to be removed, sir. Hyun-woo's voice carried exactly the right mix of worry and difference. "I came as soon as I heard. The staff said you'd collapsed. Internal bleeding." Jin-suk's voice was weak, threading with pain that wasn't entirely false. Walking 15 steps every night had consequences. The old injury finally failing. "Have you called for doctors?" Hyun-woo moved closer. Each step calculated. "No time. Minutes maybe." Jin-suk's eyes opened, meeting Hyun-woo's with an intensity that belied his supposed condition. "Need to transfer authority before I'm gone. Can't leave the organization vulnerable." Sarah watched Hyun-woo's face, saw the flash of triumph. He couldn't quite hide. This was it. The moment he'd orchestrated for months. Jin-suk incapacitated. Authority in flux. Opportunity ripe for seizure. "Of course." Hyun-woo pulled out his phone. "I'll initiate emergency protocols. Transfer command to the council." Jin-suk's hand moved weakly toward Sarah. "To you. Emergency succession. You're most qualified." The lie was so perfect it hurt to hear. Sarah squeezed Jin-suk's hand, playing her part. The frightened woman watching her employer slip away. Her thumb found his pulse point. Strong, steady, ready. Hyun-woo hesitated. "Sir, the council should vote." "No time for votes." Jin-suk's breathing turned ragged. "Need you to promise. Protect the organization no matter what." Hyun-woo's voice was silk over steel. "I'll protect everything you've built." "Swear it." "I swear." Hyun-woo moved closer still until he stood at the foot of the bed. Close enough to watch Jin-suk die. Close enough to ensure it happened. "On everything I hold sacred, I will protect this organization." Jin-suk's eyes closed. "Witness this." Succession activated. Marcus nodded stiffly, his hand near his weapon. Sarah felt the tension coiling tighter, waiting for the moment to snap. Hyun-woo pulled out a small tablet. "I'll need your access codes for the transition in the safe behind the painting." Jin-suk's hand lifted weakly, pointing to the far wall combination written down. "Didn't trust my memory." It was the bait, the final lure. Hyun-woo moved toward the painting, his back to the bed, and Sarah saw his guard drop for the first time since entering. 12 steps before his legs gave out. Each night, Sarah was his anchor. She learned the rhythm of his breathing, the warning signs when pain was about to overwhelm him, the exact pressure needed to support without insulting his pride. And each night, the intimacy of it grew. Not romance. Nothing so simple, but a connection forged in shared purpose and vulnerability that felt more binding than any promise. On the 5th night, after he'd successfully walked 15 steps and collapsed back into his chair with a gasp of triumph, he looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," he said simply. "You're paying me," she replied. But there was no heat in it. "Not for this." His hand caught hers before she could step away. "For this. You're doing it because you choose to. That's worth more than money." Sarah's throat tightened. She didn't want to acknowledge what was happening between them. Didn't want to name the way her heart raced when he touched her, or the way she found herself thinking about him during the hours they were apart. He was the man who'd ordered the attack that killed her sister. Nothing could erase that. Nothing should make her care about him. But she did. God help her, she did. "The council meeting is tomorrow," she said, pulling her hand free. "Are you ready?" "Almost." He rolled the chair to his safe, opened it with quick, precise movements, and pulled out a file. "This is yours. Everything I have about that night. Names, orders, evidence." Sarah's heart stopped. "You said you'd give it to me after we dealt with Hyun-woo." He held the file out. But I also know that promises made under duress aren't really promises. You've earned this regardless of what happens tomorrow. She took it with trembling hands. The file was thick, heavy with the weight of 8 years of grief. Inside would be answers, truth, maybe even justice. Why now? Because if something goes wrong tomorrow, I want you to have it. His expression was grave. And because you trusted me enough to help me walk, I should trust you enough to give you what you came for. Sarah clutched the file to her chest, felt tears prick her eyes, and blinked them away furiously. Don't die tomorrow, she said, and her voice was raw. I don't intend to. But if I do, finish this. Make sure Hyunwoo pays. Make sure the council knows what he did. Jin-suk, promise me. I promise. The words came out fierce. But you're not going to die. You're going to walk into that council chamber, and you're going to destroy him, and then we're going to figure out what the hell happens next. His smile was small, surprised, and achingly genuine. What happens next? He repeated softly. I like the sound of that. So did she. More than she should, more than was safe. Sarah left with the file clutched against her heart, and the terrifying knowledge that somewhere along the way she'd stopped seeing Jin-suk as a target and started seeing him as something far more dangerous, as someone worth saving. Jin-suk's driver waited by the car, helped Sarah load the wheelchair. They drove in comfortable silence through streets that felt different now, less threatening, more familiar, home maybe, or the beginning of one. Your mother is formidable, Jin-suk said finally. She survived the Choi family, your attack, and 8 years in hiding. Formidable doesn't begin to cover it. Sarah laced her fingers through his. Thank you for keeping her safe, for bringing me to her. Thank you for not shooting me when you had the chance. His smile was our why. It would have been inconvenient. That's what you're calling our entire relationship, among other things. He pulled her closer until she was pressed against his side, despite the confines of the car. Complicated, dangerous, completely inadvisable by any rational standard, but perfect despite all that, or maybe because of it. His lips brushed her temple. We're both broken pieces that somehow fit together. Redemption built from sin. Salvation born from forbidden choices. Sarah closed her eyes, breathing him in. Expensive cologne and gun oil, and something uniquely him that she'd come to crave. Where do we go from here? Forward. His voice was certain. Together, we clean up the last of Hyunwoo's network, stabilize the organization, build something better than what came before, and then we get married, start a life that's more than just survival, maybe even find happiness if we're lucky. You think we deserve happiness after everything? His honesty was brutal as always. But I think we've earned the right to try, and that's enough. The car pulled up to the penthouse tower. Guards nodded as they passed. The elevator rose through 50 stories of carefully maintained power. And when they finally entered the space that had become theirs, marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows and the ghost of every conversation they'd had, Sarah felt something settle in her chest. Hard-won and blood-bought, and absolutely earned. I love you, she said. Not a confession, a statement of fact. Simple and certain. Jin-suk's smile was soft. You've loved me since the night you helped me take those first 15 steps, maybe even before. Arrogant, accurate. He pulled her down into his lap, unmindful of the wheelchair, holding her like she was precious, breakable, his, and I love you. Have since you chose to stand beside me instead of shooting me in the back. We're both terrible at this romance thing, probably. His fingers traced her spine, gentle and possessive. But we're learning together, the word that had become their promise, their future, their salvation. Sarah kissed him slowly, thoroughly, pouring 8 years of grief and rage and desperate hope into the contact. He kissed her back like a man who'd been given a second chance he never expected to receive. Inside the penthouse, two people who should have been enemies held each other and breathed. Planned futures, chose each other despite every logical reason not to. They were both damaged, both dangerous, both carrying sins that would never be fully erased. But they were together, and in the brutal world they inhabited, that was more than miracle. It was salvation, forbidden and fragile, and absolutely real. And for now, in this moment, it was enough. 3 weeks after the council chamber, Sarah woke to the sound of rain against bulletproof glass and the warmth of Jin-suk's breathing against her shoulder. The penthouse had become home in ways she'd never expected, transformed from a fortress of isolation into something that felt like sanctuary. Morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting everything in soft gold. And for a moment, she let herself pretend they were ordinary people waking up in an ordinary world. The illusion shattered when Jin Suk's phone buzzed against the nightstand. The encrypted tone that meant business, the kind that couldn't wait for coffee or stolen moments of peace. He answered without opening his eyes, voice still rough with sleep, but immediately alert. Marcus speaking. Jin Suk's body tensed beside her. When? How many? His eyes opened, meeting hers in the dim light. We'll be there in an hour. The Choi family had made their move. Not the broken remnants that Hyun Woo had been feeding information to, but the main branch, the old guard who'd decided that Jin Suk's organization had grown too powerful, too threatening to ignore. They'd hit 3 of his legitimate businesses simultaneously, coordinated strikes designed to send a message that the war Hyun Woo had started was far from over. Sarah felt the familiar weight of weapons beneath her clothes as they dressed in silence. The comfortable routine of people who'd learned that survival required constant vigilance. Jin Suk moved with fluid grace, the wheelchair abandoned now except for public appearances where weakness served his purposes better than strength. The recovery he'd hidden for months was complete, his body rebuilt through pain and determination into something deadlier than it had been before the attack that had nearly killed him. They're testing us, he said as they rode the elevator down to the garage. Seeing if Hyun Woo's betrayal left us vulnerable, if his network was essential to our intelligence operations. And did it? Sarah checked her weapons one final time. The ritual as natural as breathing. Jin Suk's smile was sharp as winter steel. They're about to find out how wrong they are. The first target was a shipping warehouse in Queens, one of Jin Suk's clean operations that employed legitimate workers and moved legal cargo alongside the less legitimate business that kept the lights on. The Choi family had chosen it specifically because attacking it would force Jin Suk to respond publicly, to reveal resources he preferred to keep hidden. Sarah crouched on the rooftop across the street, watching through tactical scopes as Jin Suk's men moved into position. Below, 15 Choi family soldiers had taken defensive positions throughout the warehouse, hostages scattered among the cargo containers to complicate any assault. It was elegant in its brutality, a trap designed to make Jin Suk choose between his principles and his power. The problem with elegant traps, Sarah reflected as she adjusted her rifle's scope, was that they assumed your target would play by the rules you expected. Jin Suk had never been particularly concerned with expectations. The assault lasted 7 minutes. Not the hours of negotiation and careful maneuvering the Choi family had planned for, but a surgical strike that left their soldiers unconscious or dead and their hostages unharmed. Sarah's role was simple: overwatch and elimination of threats that Jin Suk's ground team couldn't handle. She took 3 shots, each one precisely placed to disable rather than kill, because despite everything they'd been through, she still believed some lines shouldn't be crossed unless absolutely necessary. When the smoke cleared, literally and figuratively, Jin Suk stood in the center of the warehouse, surrounded by rescued workers and neutralized enemies. His voice carried clearly as he addressed the security cameras he knew the Choi family was watching through. This ends now. No more games, no more testing boundaries. Your people attacked mine, threatened innocents to make a point. The point is received and rejected. He gestured to the unconscious Choi soldiers. These men will live because I choose mercy today. Tomorrow, if you force my hand again, I will choose differently. The message was delivered to every Choi family's safe house within 6 hours, along with detailed intelligence about their operations that made it clear Jin Suk's network was not only intact, but more extensive than they'd imagined. Hyun Woo's betrayal hadn't weakened the organization. It had revealed weaknesses that were now being systematically eliminated and replaced with something stronger. That evening, Sarah found Jin Suk standing at the windows of his office, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. The weight of leadership sat heavy on his shoulders, the constant calculations required to maintain power in a world where weakness was death and mercy was often seen as both. "You're thinking too loud," she said, moving to stand beside him. Her reflection joined his in the glass, 2 figures outlined against the darkness beyond. He turned, pulling her into his arms with the desperate intensity of a man who'd learned that happiness was fragile and temporary. "The Choi family won't stop," he said quietly. This was just the opening move. They'll escalate, bring in outside resources, maybe even reach out to federal authorities if they get desperate enough. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that criminals might turn to law enforcement when criminal methods failed to achieve their goals. Then we escalate too, Sarah replied. We've been playing defense since Hyun-woo's arrest. Maybe it's time to remind people why attacking you was always a mistake. Jin-suk's smile was predatory. I've been waiting for you to say that. The shift in strategy required planning that stretched over weeks, a chess game played with human pieces across a board that encompassed half the eastern seaboard. Sarah found herself at the center of it, not as Jin-suk's assistant or lover, but as his partner in the truest sense. Her skills, honed through years of hunting him and refined through months of working beside him, made her uniquely qualified to plan operations that required both tactical precision and strategic thinking. The Choi family's main compound was located in a converted mansion in the Hamptons, surrounded by enough security to stop a small army, but not enough to stop two people who understood that sometimes the best way through a fortress was to walk in the front door. Sarah's approach was elegantly simple. She would attend the Choi family's annual charity gala as the representative of a shell company Jin-suk had established months earlier, one with a legitimate business profile and an invitation that had been secured through careful manipulation of social connections. While the Choi family's attention was focused on their public image, Jin-suk would infiltrate their private security network and extract intelligence about their future operations. The dress Jin-suk provided was a masterpiece of concealed lethality, elegant enough to fit among Manhattan's social elite, while hiding enough weaponry to handle significant resistance. Sarah stood before the mirror in their bedroom, adjusting the neckline to ensure her scars remained hidden, and felt the familiar pre-operation calm settle over her mind. You don't have to do this, Jin-suk said from behind her. We could find another way, something with less risk. She turned to face him, seeing her own reflection in his dark eyes. We could, she agreed. But this way is faster, cleaner, and it sends the right message. Besides, I've been wanting to see how the other half lives. His laugh was soft but strained. The other half that wants us dead. All the more reason to crash their party. The gala was exactly what Sarah had expected. A carefully orchestrated display of wealth and influence designed to create the illusion that the Choi family were legitimate businesspeople rather than the criminal organization everyone knew them to be. She moved through the crowds with practiced ease, making conversation with politicians and business leaders while mentally cataloging security positions and escape routes. The intelligence gathering went smoothly until she found herself face to face with Elena Choi, the family matriarch whose iron control had held the organization together through 3 decades of territorial wars and federal investigations. She was a woman in her 70s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, and she looked at Sarah with the focused attention of a predator recognizing another predator. You're not who you pretend to be, Elena said without preamble, her voice carrying just enough to be heard over the string quartet playing in the corner. Sarah's training kicked in, maintaining her cover identity while preparing for the possibility that her mission had been compromised. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand what you mean. Elena's smile was thin as a knife blade. Jin-suk's woman. The one who destroyed my nephew's plans and helped orchestrate his downfall. You move like a soldier, dress like a socialite, and watch exits like someone expecting trouble. The question is what you're doing in my home. For a moment, Sarah considered maintaining the pretense, but something in Elena's expression suggested that honesty might be more effective than deception. I'm here to deliver a message, she said quietly. Elena's eyebrows rose slightly. I'm listening. This war ends now. Not because Jin-suk is weak, but because he's strong enough to choose peace when his enemies choose wisdom. Your family has lost this fight. The question is whether you'll acknowledge that before or after the cost becomes unbearable. Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face as if reading something written in a language only she understood. You love him, she said finally. It wasn't a question. More than I thought possible. The admission came easier than Sarah had expected. Elena nodded slowly. Love makes us capable of terrible things, child. It also makes us capable of mercy we wouldn't otherwise consider. She gestured toward a private door at the far end of the ballroom. Come. There are things we need to discuss away from curious ears. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and changed everything. Elena Choi was tired, not just physically, but in the bone-deep way that came from decades of violence and loss. She'd buried 3 sons and a husband to territorial wars, watched her organization splinter under federal pressure and internal betrayal, and reached the conclusion that survival required adaptation rather than continued conflict. The terms they negotiated were complex, but fair. Territory would be divided, with clear boundaries that both organizations would respect. Information would be shared when threats emerged that endangered both families. Most importantly, the blood debt created by Hyun-woo's actions would be considered paid, the slate wiped clean in exchange for guarantees that no further revenge would be sought by either side. Sarah left the gala with intelligence that would have taken months to gather through conventional means, and the foundation for a peace that both sides could live with. Jin Suk was waiting in the penthouse when she returned, still dressed in the tactical gear he'd worn for his infiltration of the Choi security network. The contrast between his dark efficiency and her evening gown elegance would have been absurd under other circumstances, but tonight it felt like a perfect representation of who they'd become together. "How did it go?" they asked simultaneously, then laughed at the synchronicity. "You first," Jin Suk said, helping her out of the dress that had served as both disguise and armor. Sarah told him about Elena, about the conversation that had turned a reconnaissance mission into a peace negotiation. She watched his expression shift from surprise to calculation to something that might have been relief. He told her about the intelligence he'd gathered, the detailed understanding of Choi family operations that would ensure compliance with any agreement they reached. When they finished debriefing, they stood together in the silence of their bedroom, processing the reality that the war that had defined their relationship might actually be ending. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, echoing the question that had become their refrain. "Now we figure out who we are when we're not fighting to survive," Jin Suk replied. "Now we learn what normal looks like for people like us." Normal, as it turned out, was more challenging than war in many ways. Without external threats to focus on, they were forced to confront the psychological aftermath of everything they'd experienced together. Sarah found herself waking from nightmares about burning buildings and dying children. Jin Suk struggled with the transition from absolute control to something approaching partnership and collaboration. They fought, not the deadly conflicts of their enemies, but the messy, complicated arguments of 2 people learning to build a life together. They made up, sometimes with words, sometimes with silence, always with the understanding that whatever they were building was worth the effort it required. 6 months after the Choi family gala, Jin Suk's organization had evolved into something that bore little resemblance to the criminal enterprise Sarah had originally infiltrated. Still dangerous, still operating outside conventional law, but focused now on protection rather than expansion, on building rather than destroying. Sarah's role had evolved too, from assistant to partner to something that had no official title but encompassed strategic planning, operational oversight, and the kind of informal diplomacy that prevented small conflicts from becoming wars. She was good at it, better than she'd expected, and found satisfaction in using skills that had been honed for destruction in service of something constructive. The wedding, when it finally happened, was a small affair held in the penthouse with only the people who mattered most in attendance. Sarah's mother, recovered from years of hiding and slowly rebuilding her relationship with her daughter. Marcus, who'd become something approaching a friend despite his professional obligation to maintain emotional distance. A handful of other trusted associates who understood that what they were witnessing was not just a personal commitment, but a political alliance that would shape the organization's future. Elena Choi attended as well, her presence both blessing and warning that the peace they'd negotiated was built on personal relationships as much as strategic calculation. Sarah wore a dress that was elegant without being ostentatious. Jin Suk a suit that managed to look both formal and ready for action. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promises that acknowledged the darkness they'd emerged from while committing to whatever light they could build together. When Jin Suk kissed her, Sarah tasted 8 years of grief transformed into hope, betrayal redeemed through trust, and the possibility that even people like them could find something approaching happiness. The reception was held on the penthouse terrace, Manhattan spreading out below them like a map of conquered territory. They danced to music that was soft enough to talk over, surrounded by people who understood that celebration in their world was always tinged with the awareness that nothing good lasted forever. But for tonight, for this moment, forever felt possible. Years later, when journalists and academics tried to analyze the transformation of Jin Suk's organization from criminal enterprise to something approaching a private security company, they would focus on economic factors and law enforcement pressure and changing social dynamics. They would miss the human element, the way two people who should have been enemies had instead chosen to save each other, and how that choice had rippled outward to change everything they touched. Sarah never spoke to those journalists, never participated in the academic studies. Her story was private, personal, written in scars and shared glances, and the quiet moments when she and Jin Suk sat together watching the city they'd helped reshape. She'd started this journey hunting for revenge and found something far more valuable: the understanding that redemption was possible even for people who'd done unforgivable things, as long as they were willing to do the work of becoming better. Jin Suk kept the wheelchair in their bedroom closet, not as a reminder of weakness, but as a symbol of the deception that had brought them together. Sometimes Sarah would catch him looking at it with an expression she couldn't quite read, and she understood that he was remembering not just the physical limitations it had represented, but the emotional armor he'd built around his vulnerabilities. They were both different people now, scarred but healing, dangerous but committed to using that danger in service of something larger than themselves. The organization they'd built together was neither purely legitimate nor entirely criminal, but something new, something that existed in the spaces between law and justice, where people like them could find purpose. On quiet evenings, when the city settled into the rhythm of ordinary life, and their penthouse felt like a refuge rather than a fortress, Sarah would sometimes think about the girl she'd been 8 years ago, burning for revenge and convinced that violence was the only answer to violence. That girl would have been horrified by the choices Sarah had made, the compromises she'd accepted, the love she'd found in the last place she'd expected to look for it. But that girl had been broken by trauma and loss, driven by pain to make decisions that could have destroyed her as thoroughly as any external enemy. The woman Sarah had become understood that survival sometimes required adaptation, that strength could be found in vulnerability, and that the most profound victories were often the ones that looked like surrender to outside observers. Jin Suk had taught her that power without purpose was just destruction waiting to happen, that real strength came from choosing restraint when violence would be easier, from building rather than tearing down. She'd taught him that trust was not weakness, that allowing someone to see your vulnerabilities could make you stronger rather than more fragile, that love was not the enemy of survival, but sometimes its greatest ally. Together, they'd learned that redemption was not a destination but a daily choice, a commitment to being better than they'd been, to using their skills and resources in service of something larger than their individual desires for revenge or control. The world they'd built was not perfect, would never be perfect, but it was theirs, and it was real, and it was enough. On nights when the rain hammered against bulletproof glass and the city lights looked like stars reflected in dark water, Sarah would lie beside Jin Suk and listen to his breathing, steady and strong and utterly human. She'd think about the path that had brought them together, the violence and betrayal and loss that had seemed like the end of everything, but had instead been the beginning of something neither of them had known they needed. They were both terrible at this romance thing, probably, but they were learning together, and that word had become their promise, their future, their salvation. In the brutal world they inhabited, love was more than a miracle. It was a choice they made every day, a commitment to seeing the human being behind the armor of necessity and control. And for now, in this moment and all the moments that followed, it was enough. It was everything.